Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, June 1st, 2020. The summer of rage is unfolding. And I am frankly distressed and a little depressed today. With a demagogue in the White House who revels in a race and class war, events are giving Trump the ammunition, if you will, to move us even further into a totalitarian state and possibly secure his re-election in November. And I'm sure everyone feels the same inner queasiness, a strong expression of opposition to the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis exactly a week ago. Great sympathy for the heartfelt anger and real rage that African Americans feel and that many other people support. But there's so many layers to this that I want to delve into today. I reviewed over 60 different news accounts. I submitted to more than 10 hours of television viewing of the protests, the police brutality, and the egregious looting that has broken out in too many cities across the country. And this kind of chaos, as I argue, feeds the fears of Trump's supporters, whose connection to him is based on their own insecurities, their own false sense of victimization. And I fear where we are headed. Back in 1968, it was quite a year. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was killed. There were police riots as the SDS and other protesters gathered at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. When the malaprop-prone boss of Chicago, Mayor Richard J. Daley, made the unforgettable comment, "The police are here to preserve disorder." And in many locations across the country, starting with Minneapolis, the police contributed significantly to the violence that resulted. And I'm going to here arbitrarily separate out, and I'll comment on it later, the gangs of opportunist looters. I kind of put the property damage in a separate category. But the police and the wall-to-wall television coverage, I think, produced many of the initial sparks that have led to a political and emotional wildfire across the country. And let me lead with the conservative account of this, the New York Times. Headline, "Facing protests over use of force, police respond with more force." And they catalog it. In Salt Lake City, officers in riot gear shoved a man with a cane to the ground. Did you see that one? He appeared to be lost, just taking a walk, and suddenly he's surrounded by cops. They walk past him, and then they come back, and they just knock him over. Have you seen that video? I think most people by now have seen the Brooklyn scene where two police cars plowed into a crowd, one that was in motion, the other which had been at a stop. And we'll go into detail about that incident in a little bit. Last night I saw the coverage of Atlanta police officers. I believe the incident was on Saturday night, but they were enforcing a curfew. They stopped two college students in a car, and they tased them relentlessly, and then dragged them out of the vehicle. They had smashed the driver's side window of the car as the incident was initiated. These students didn't appear to have any bad intentions. They were in the wrong place at that particular time. And there's a video circulating. One of my listeners sent it to me and claimed it had occurred in California. But when I asked her for the location, she acknowledged that this occurred in Minneapolis, where officers and militarized National Guard members were marching down a residential street, yelling at people to get inside. And when one family remained on their porch too long, one of the officers said, "Light 'em up." And one of the troops started firing. Hopefully those were the rubber bullets. And so far, I haven't heard anyone issue a shoot-to-kill order. But in this climate, with the demagogue, bully, and would-be tyrant we have in the White House, it's something that I fear is imminent. And we've seen all of those Pentagon bits of hardware, the Bearcat all-terrain vehicles that are prepared for, chemical and biological incidents. We saw the cops relentlessly shooting tear gas and rubber bullets at nonviolent protesters. That's even before curfews were imposed, giving them at least a pretext to clear the streets. And so this is an ugly reaction to police brutality. And there are hundreds of scenes. And I got an email from my friend Jerry Frasia in Italy over the weekend. And he's, last week I talked a lot about Trump and Twitter and how much I don't like Twitter. But I actually spent a lot of time looking at tweets of people posting short videos of interactions with the cops. They were downright horrendous. The arrogance, the impunity that police officers, I was going to say enjoy. I don't know that anybody enjoys it, but that they employ, it is just so far out of line. So there have also been scenes, one in Minneapolis, one in Seattle, where officers used their knees. I believe one of the male college student in Atlanta was briefly held down to the ground with a knee. Do they do that on purpose to show that they cannot be restrained? That they cannot be held to a reasonable level of force? And we've also seen political officials. There was a member of the Virginia House of Delegates who I saw interviewed late last night on MSNBC, and in his own district, he went to observe a protest. And he said it was a police riot. He identified himself to the officers. They ignored him. In fact, 3 different times, he was the target of a flash bomb delivered by a police officer. And so this becomes such a dangerous situation. And Keith Ellison, who I know a little bit, has been put in charge of the investigation in Minneapolis. That is an important step forward, at least symbolically. And I don't know if this is a relative of Keith's, but a member of the city council, Jeremiah Ellison, said that the police started it. They started the violence. No one was looting anything in the first night of this protest. No one was lighting anything on fire on the first night of this protest. And yet the response from the police was incredibly brutal. The original provocation to street violence was from our officers. And he continued, one of the city's employees has just murdered someone in the most brutal fashion. And for you to then pretend like you're the victim and you're under siege, to fire mace and tear gas and rubber bullets in response to water bottles being thrown, you have at that point 100% antagonized the situation. And late on Friday night, I watched a news conference where the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, was presiding. And the contrast between him and the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, couldn't have been greater. Walz was high on adrenaline, and they had just gotten beaten for the second night in a row by the protesters and some looters. And Walz reverted to a kind of military posture, talking in, bureaucratic language and cop talk. And at that point, he announced he was calling out the National Guard. And a bit later, in this news conference that was being held at 2 a.m., Minneapolis time, Mayor Frey made an appearance. And the look on his face was one of total defeat. His efforts to acknowledge the damage of the death of George Floyd and its deep implications, the rage that ensued, had not managed to quell the angry crowds. And it's clear that he had lost the struggle to try to tamp down the situation by not escalating. And he didn't talk in police lingo. He spoke from his heart. And Jacob Frey is an imperfect politician, like so many. He was elected to office 2 years ago on a pledge to clean up the police, and he got into office and, according to the local experts, promptly did nothing. If anything, he capitulated to the powerful police department and the police union. And the union boss has been at Trump rallies, congratulating Trump for, lifting these onerous consent decrees with the Obama Justice Department to clean up the police departments. And he clearly presents as a defeated man. And they're based in Minneapolis. Mint Press News has provided excellent coverage of the events of the past week there. And a tip of my hat to Alan McLeod. I'm citing 3 different articles of his today in the show file for today's podcast. One is about the pattern of police escalating all over the country. And he opens with the cruisers that rammed down members of the crowd in Brooklyn. Again, we'll get into more detail on that in a moment. He says, a common police tactic in protest situations is to escalate the violence themselves, hoping demonstrators will respond in kind, giving them an excuse to use even more excessive force. And he recalls Occupy Wall Street, the man in Salt Lake City that I referenced, holding a cane and being knocked over. In Seattle, cops brutalized a protester, one officer leaning his knee on the man's neck. In Houston, a mounted police officer trampled a female bystander with his horse. In Minneapolis, researcher Tanya Kurson shared video footage of amped-up police attacking her on her own property. That's the scene I referenced, firing at her and her house. Another scene from New York, Dunya Zaire, a young woman, was assaulted by a policeman, shouting that she was a stupid fucking bitch before throwing her to the ground. I've seen that video. Cops in Erie, Pennsylvania were caught on camera kicking a young girl lying in the street they kicked her in the face. And the reason was that she had covered her face after being hit with tear gas. Hollywood actor John Cusack was attacked in Los Angeles. Cops reacted to him filming a burning car by running at him with batons and hitting his bike. In one instance, and some of this blurs together, but I believe it was Minneapolis, a cop used his bicycle as a weapon. He grabbed it, by the bars and used it to shove a black man to the ground. And a white woman, I recall vividly, she was wearing a red shift. She just stepped right up, grabbed the bicycle and pushed the cop over on his back. And she didn't look like a big, brawny woman. She was quite slight, but clearly she wanted to make a statement. TV producer Andrew Kimmel, alleges that Minneapolis police slashed the tires on his car, as well as those of every other car in the parking lot. Multiple elected officials have reported being attacked by police, as I mentioned. Police also appear to be making a point to shut down reporting of the situation, as a huge amount of attacks on journalists have been reported. Maybe you've seen the ugly picture of Linda Tirado, a freelance reporter, who is now permanently blind in her left eye after taking a direct hit from a rubber projectile. Other journalists, police in Louisville hit one local reporter for a TV affiliate while she was reporting live on the air. In Denver, employees of the Post were attacked while covering their local demonstrations. Photographer Hyung Chang noted that police aimed and shot him twice. Another Post employee, Elise Schmelzer, was targeted while wearing a reflective vest that read Press. L.A. Times reporter Molly Hennessy Fisk reported that police attacked her and a group of other journalists firing tear gas at point-blank range. A CBS crew, completely alone in a deserted parking lot, was set upon by police firing rubber bullets at them. Minnesota police also shot a Reuters crew on Saturday with rubber bullets. And I will acknowledge that television does fan the flames, because the perverse incentive for TV is to cover the violence and the fires that create these very powerful images. And as somebody who's been a party to many, many peaceful protests over the years where the media didn't bother to show up, or if they did, they didn't put it on the air, it was because nobody even lit a trash can on fire. Nobody threw a plastic water bottle at a cop. And people know this now. We also have a situation where there have been more than a few incidents where members of the public have seen cops committing vandalism. In Seattle, police were caught on camera smashing through the door of a local Target that appeared to be far away from any conflict or commotion. In Boston, video circulated appearing to show multiple police officers destroying their own car. In San Bernardino, here in California, protesters claimed they held 4 hours of peaceful demonstrations until the police arrived, at which point the area was engulfed in flames. Now, some of these accounts deserve further investigation. They could be coincidental. But the taser attack in Atlanta wasn't. And last week I reported to you about Umbrella Man, the guy in Minneapolis who turns out to be a member of the police department. And I've seen the video where he calmly walks along this retail auto parts store, the AutoZone, smashing in each window deliberately and methodically. So the incident in Brooklyn is one that the video has, certainly gone viral. You have one police cruiser, it's an SUV, that is at a standstill. Protesters bring up one of those yellow barriers, a metal barrier, put it in front of the cop car, and then people I saw a bouquet being thrown, water bottles, a traffic cone, but I didn't see anything that looked like a weapon or a rock or something that could do any serious damage. And while that is occurring, a second cruiser comes up to the right of the first one. And it doesn't stop. It's going 5 or 10 miles an hour, but it just plows right through the crowd, I guess attempting to create an opening, like a big football lineman, for the other guy to peel off and get out of there. I believe it was a coordinated action. But then the first cruiser, and I've looked at this video several times, and you feel free to look at it again yourselves. But the first cruiser had the option to back up. There was no crowd behind him. Maybe there was one person back there. But he easily could have backed out of the situation and de-escalated. But instead, he hit the gas. Like the incident in Charlottesville. I can't remember the kid's name from Toledo who drove his muscle car into the crowd on purpose. And Mayor de Blasio's reaction was really lame. He said, well, you got to understand that they were in a pickle and they were scared. He said, I saw people converging on the police vehicle. I saw people throwing things at the vehicle. That is not peaceful protest. Let's not kid ourselves. Well, like I say, that was a really lame response from the mayor of New York. And I understand he has his issues with the police department and the police union. They have publicly shamed him by turning their backs on him as he is speaking at public events. And so they turned the tables on him, and they released the arrest record of his 25-year-old daughter, who was arrested on Saturday at a protest scene somewhere in New York. And that is deeply inappropriate. The cops used a guy from the police union took a picture of a British newspaper that had the story about de Blasio's daughter. Her name is Chiara de Blasio. And so this is way out of line because the arrest report that was published now included her personal information. But I still think that de Blasio has no basis to defend the cops for their indefensible use of police cruisers as battering rams. It appears nobody was seriously injured in that event. But that is largely beside the point. So now I want to talk about the looters, because this is the part that breaks my heart. I can defend clashes with police and National Guardsmen when they brutalize nonviolent protesters. But in too many cities, including suburban locations, we saw a wave of looting over this past weekend. And as I looked at the pictures, and this is not evidence, this is anecdotal, the vast majority that you could identify were African American males. And they took advantage of the distraction that the police were dealing with in a protest even as close as a block or two away. And in Philadelphia, in Santa Monica, and in the East Bay suburbs of San Francisco, Walnut Creek, looters just ransacked. Well, they broke windows and doors, they ransacked stores, and they're so stupid about it. Because repeatedly, on the TV footage, you can identify their faces. You can see what kind of ball cap they were wearing, what kind of branded footwear, skate shoes and Nikes that they were either wearing or carrying out of these stores. And then they loaded them into their own cars with the license plates clearly visible. And this happened at the Grove, a shopping center in West L.A., in the Fairfax Melrose district. And maybe people can rationalize, hey, Target's located in Minneapolis, so, I'm going to rampage through a Target store. But I, in a macabre way, I cracked up when I heard that these kids had broken into a Marshall's. Now, they sell second-rate merchandise at low, low prices. If you're going to loot, I can understand going to an Apple store or a Best Buy, grab that big screen TV you've always wanted. But so many of the victims were storefronts owned by African Americans, by immigrants like the Somali community in Minneapolis, Latino families who had built up businesses in L.A. And this comes at a time when, we got 40 million people out of work. And how does stealing a pair of Vans skate shoes address your need to get a paycheck and to buy groceries? It's so wanton and gratuitous and so dangerously counterproductive. And I know you don't need a lecture about this. I don't believe any one of my listeners would be out there looting. But it pains me to see these mostly young, mostly black, not entirely male. Oh, there were a couple of white guys, jumping in the fray, and a few women as well, running off with merchandise. But the vast majority of these people will face charges for it, partly because they're so sloppy at their craft of burglary. And they will wind up serving some time in jail or in prison. So many officials, starting with Governor Walz in Minnesota, have said, the people who attended the protesters, they're all local, they're, mixed race. They mean well, even if some of them get a little rowdy. But there is a looter element. And there are also provocateurs. And Trump and Bill Barr flatly assume that any provocateurs are from the political left. They don't think about the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the white supremacists from Atomwaffen, who use the fog of that tear gas to just rumble through with a lot of destruction and a good dollop of violence. So here's Governor Walz. We have reason to believe that bad actors continue to infiltrate the rightful protests of George Floyd's murder, which is why we're extending the protest. And John Miller, who used to be featured on 60 Minutes, he's now the deputy commissioner in charge of NYPD's counterterrorism. He said that anarchists had planned to start mayhem in the city even before the protests began, using encrypted communication to raise bail money, recruit medics. During the demonstrations, they maintained supply routes to distribute gasoline, rocks, and bottles, and also dispatched scouts to find areas devoid of police officers. Now, considering the source, that could be entirely bullshit. But I am prepared to believe that there is a range of groups willing to embrace violence, some with political motives. They want a civil war. Some who just, get a kind of sexual thrill out of beating people up and destroying things. But the portrayal of this as a leftist wave, and that Antifa is by definition leftist, I think is dangerously wrong. And of course, Trump tweeted that, he's going to declare that Antifa is a terrorist group. BFD. Nobody knows who's in Antifa. The ones who made a series of mayhem events in Berkeley because what's his name? Milo Yiannopoulos was going to give a speech. I don't believe those are leftists. But despite all of the technology that law enforcement has? Maybe the anarchists know not to carry their smartphones with them when they're on duty. But if Miller is to be believed about social media commentary, there was one of the looters arrested in Walnut Creek yesterday who had posted on Facebook, "I think I need a new iPad." Now, that's it's a leading comment, and since he was arrested for looting, you can put those two together. But we really don't know who some of these groups are or might be. And Keith Ellison, he's the Attorney General now in Minnesota, former Democratic congressman. The truth is, nobody really knows, he said. There's been a lot of videotape taken by demonstrators of people who are very suspicious, who really did start breaking windows. There have been other photographs of cars with no license plates. Very suspicious behavior. But he's correct to say that we don't really know. And Trump himself was hunkered down in the White House over the weekend. He did escape for a while to go to Cape Canaveral to watch the launch of the SpaceX mission with 2 astronauts. And he did make a statement there that doesn't mean much, but the idea that he's been completely invisible or silent isn't really true. But he did hunker down in the White House, and I just saw a headline that he's planning to give a nationwide address sometime in the next few hours. But in many respects, I think the less he tweets and the less visible he is, the better off we are, and the likelihood of the situation calming down in some manner is greater. And Trump, with his predisposition to blame the left, fell for a deceptively edited video that was posted on Twitter by a guy named Elijah Schaffer. And he took footage from an incident in Dallas. And I'll just save you the trouble of getting to the point here. But the selective editing, the deceptive editing, ignored the fact that the man who was attacked had attacked other people with a machete. And he was portrayed as a poor guy who was trying to protect his store. That is not true. And so there is propaganda out there, and one of the biggest consumers of it is the guy who is hunkered down in the White House on these very lonely nights in Washington, D.C. So here is Trump speaking on a conference call today, Monday, to most, if not all, of the governors of the 50 states. And he has not tempered his rhetoric. The bully-in-chief is encouraging more violence.
It shouldn't be hard to take care of, and we're going to take care of it. And we've got a number of people here that you'll be seeing a lot of. General Milley is here, who's head of Joint Chiefs of Staff, a fighter, a warrior, had a lot of victories, had no losses. And he hates to see the way it's being handled in the various states, and I've just put him in charge. The Attorney General is here, right here, Bill Barr, and we will activate Bill Barr and activate him very strongly. We're strongly, and Secretary of Defense is here, we're strongly looking for arrests. You have to get much tougher. You're going to get overridden. I know Governor Walz is on the phone, and we spoke, and I fully agree with the way he handled it the last couple of days. I asked him to do that. Get a lot of men. We have all the men and women that you need, but people aren't calling them up. You have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. They're going to run over you. You're going to look like a bunch of jerks. You have to dominate. And you have to arrest people, and you have to try people, and they have to go to jail for long periods of time. I saw what happened in Philadelphia. I saw what happened in Dallas, where they kicked a guy to death. I don't know if he died or not, but if he didn't, it's a miracle what they did to him. They were kicking him like I've never seen anything like it in my life.
So that is the incident that I just cited. The man with a machete. And Trump just saw a snippet of it on a video and assumed that that was the truth. And for a guy who lies relentlessly and reflexively, he ought to have a little skepticism about what he watches and whether it's true or not. And so, going back to 1968, following the brutal Summer of Rage, Nixon was able to appeal to frightened Americans. He called them the silent majority. And the silent majority, in his view, supported the war in Vietnam and supported head-cracking by cops all over America, regardless of the origin of the protests or even riots that they were brutally suppressing. And I feel that we're going to see history repeat itself in the summer of 2020. Want to recommend a great piece by Joe Laria at Consortium News. Because of Trump's threats to send in the U.S. military, he did activate and tell to stand by a group of military police units over the weekend. Joe digs into what the legal status is. So in 1957, when President Eisenhower, he invoked the Enforcement Acts of 1870 to send troops to Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce desegregation of the schools. In 1967, Lyndon Johnson sent 5,000 federal troops to Detroit, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, after a request from Michigan Governor George Romney. That was Mitt's daddy. Because Romney had declared a state of insurrection, and in his executive order, Johnson cited 10 U.S. Code, Chapter 15, military support for civilian law agencies. In 92, the first President Bush deployed 4,000 Army and Marine troops to Los Angeles to put down riots after they beat Rodney King. Actually, it was after the police who beat him were acquitted. He used the 1807 Insurrection Act. And then the 2012 Defense Authorization Act, the AUMF, signed by Barack Obama, which we loudly protested at the time, allows for the indefinite military detention of civilians in the U.S. and anywhere abroad. Now, there is the Posse Comitatus law, which fundamentally says that American soldiers from the federal military cannot be deployed in the United States. But those other laws appear to chip away at Posse Comitatus. I want to mention that we continue to offer grants from the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund, $100 for people who have a need to help with the rent, help with groceries, deal with your loss of income. And I'd rather give you $100 than see you, resort to looting. Maybe that's a bad joke. At any rate, I don't have any applications here today, but if you'd like to present one, all you need to do is email peter@peterbcollins.com. We have yet to reject a request for a $100 grant. So one of the things in all of the coverage that I've seen that is given really short shrift is an important detail. That before the deadly encounter with the knee of Officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis last Monday, George Floyd and Officer Chauvin had worked at the same Minneapolis Latin nightclub, both working as bouncers. Now, the details are a little sketchy because a woman who owned the club until this past January when she sold it said, well, George worked on the weekdays and Chauvin worked on the weekends, and she hinted that she had to hire Chauvin as part of an agreement with the police when she held big events. Her name's Maya Santamaria. She said she doubted that the two men interacted. But were they strangers? Before the incident where Floyd was reported to have tried to pass a $20 bill to buy some cigarettes. A counterfeit $20 bill. So, in an account in the New York Times on Saturday, it reads, this is the call to 911. Someone comes to our store and gives us fake bills, and we realize it before he left the store, and we ran back outside, and they was sitting on their car. The store clerk demanded the cigarettes back, but he doesn't want to do that, and he's sitting on his car because he's awfully drunk, and he's not in control of himself. He's not acting right. Then the dispatcher asks his race, and after some equivocation, the caller says he's a black guy. Not long after, a regular customer, former employee of the store, arrives looking for menthol cigarettes. She said the police were already outside. The clerk, a teenager, was feeling bad. He had called the police only because that was the store policy. The clerk held up a folded bill, showed it to her. It was obviously fake. The ink was still running. And Ms. Stately, Angel Stately, said she saw an officer approach Floyd with his hand at his gun at his hip. Now, there's additional video that was released that showed that Floyd was struggling with the officers, and at one point they shoved him into the SUV squad car on his belly, and his legs were flailing or they were beating him. It's not clear. But they did manage to get him handcuffed at that point and then pulled him out of the car onto the ground where Chauvin applied the knee until he died. And in an account from BuzzFeed, they cite a couple of the other people who worked at the El Nuevo Rodeo in southeast Minneapolis. Alexander Hagen worked security at the club several years ago, interacted with Chauvin. He said he knew and liked Floyd from the club scene. Crazy, said a promoter in the area, A.J. Jarecki. He said he wondered if the two men had some beef with each other, because it's odd that you treat somebody you knew like that. So this is it's unsatisfying. We do need to know more about that, and to what extent this was somewhat of a grudge that preceded the incident at the cigarette store last week. So we have hit a new low as domestic disturbances are linked to Russian meddling and their efforts to sow discord. Susan Rice, former ambassador to the UN and national security advisor under Obama, was on CNN with Wolf the Blitz. And she said, I would bet, based on my experience, and I'm not reading intelligence these days, but based on my experience, that this is right out of the Russian playbook. Adding that the U.S. cannot allow extremists and foreign actors to distract attention away from real issues. And then Wolf, the former AIPAC mouthpiece, said, you're absolutely right on the foreign interference. We know for decades the Russians, when it was the Soviet Union, the communists, have often tried to embarrass the United States by promoting the racial divide in our country. And Rice continued, we see it all the time. We've seen it for years and frankly every day on social media, where they take any divisive, painful issue, immigration, gay rights, gun violence, and always racism, and they play on both sides. Their aim is not simply to embarrass the United States, Wolf. Their aim is to divide us. Now, this is such bullshit. Give me some evidence, Ambassador Rice, because otherwise you are continuing the false deflection that we need Russia to divide Americans. We have a president who stokes these divisions on a daily basis, demagoguing. And we have a population that is ripe for it. And all of the content that comes across my Facebook feed or when I look at Twitter is from people who I know to be Americans. There's no bot that has displaced them or impersonated them. And it's just incredible to see this kind of concoction pass for commentary. So today, on my way to the secret studio, as I often do, I punched up Rush Limbaugh. He is in his dying days, stage 4 brain cancer, or I think it's brain. And I was stunned because Rush, who never allows guests on his show, and who once told me that callers are just there to make him look good, he submitted to a lengthy exchange with the African-American radio team called The Breakfast Club. You may recall, even if you don't listen to hip-hop radio, that the leader of The Breakfast Club, Charlemagne the God, was the one who Joe Biden recently gaffed to, saying, if you vote for Trump, you ain't black. Well, Charlemagne and his co-hosts really gave Rush a good exchange. I'm not saying who won or lost. That's not important. But I heard Rush Limbaugh acknowledge that George Floyd was murdered by a police officer on the streets of Minneapolis without any equivocation. And I heard Rush Limbaugh, who invented political division for the purpose of entertainment and ratings and the millions that he's made from talk radio. He's the past master who created the pathway, the glide path for Trump. Say outrageous things and get more attention. Get your right-wing listeners all riled up. That's the whole M.O. of Rush Limbaugh. And in case you don't know, I was the host who followed him on KNBR in San Francisco for several years. I interviewed him once when he came to town. He admitted to me that it's an act. But today, and maybe it's because he sees his time as extremely limited, I heard a very different Rush Limbaugh working to try to bridge divides with a team of African Americans who were not cutting him any slack on his own show. And he never lets that happen. That's the whole design of his program. So Barack Obama issued a statement, and a lot of people have been saying, where's he been? Why doesn't he appear on television? And apparently he did give one interview. I haven't seen it yet. But he issued a statement where he referenced somebody who sent him an email and a 12-year-old who wrote a song. I guess it's one of Kobe Bryant's kids. He said, it's natural to wish for life to just get back to normal as a pandemic and economic crisis upend everything around us. But we have to remember that for millions of Americans, being treated differently on account of race is tragically, painfully, maddeningly normal. Whether it's while dealing with the healthcare system or interacting with the criminal justice system or jogging down the street or just watching birds in a park. This shouldn't be normal in 2020 America. It can't be normal. If we want our children to grow up in a nation that lives up to its highest ideals, we can and must be better. Well, nice words, but he could acknowledge that he allowed the FBI and Homeland Security to roll up Occupy Wall Street. He could acknowledge the fumbling of Ferguson on his watch. Just a couple of ideas for you, Mr. Obama. Also, the NFL issued a statement on Saturday, saddened by the death of Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor in Louisville. Many pointed out that NFL teams have effectively exiled former San Francisco 49er quarterback Colin Kaepernick after he took a knee. And so who's this speaking? I'm sorry, I don't have the guy's first name. His name is Thompson, and I think he is a top player for the Jaguars. He said, I remember when the vice president and the head coach told us we couldn't kneel. Thank God we had an owner of minority status, Shahid Khan, who weighed in and got us to kneel together. Anyway, it is so deeply ironic that people were so outraged that Colin Kaepernick would take a knee during the national anthem. And he was kneeling for dead, unarmed black men, dead at the hands of police officers. Now, this one turns the table, and I object equally. On Friday night in Oakland, there was a generally peaceful protest followed by some looting. And about 9:45, a car pulled up outside the federal building on Clay Street. And from inside the car, shots were fired, killing one security guard and seriously wounding another. Now, that's an execution of an innocent guy. And I have no tolerance for that, same as I do for the killing of George Floyd. I also want to recognize that in Omaha, a 22-year-old black man was fatally shot at a protest against police brutality. We don't have enough information to know who the suspect is. In Davenport, Iowa, two officers, after demonstrations overnight on Sunday, 4 people were shot, 2 of them fatally by unknown assailants. The 2 who were injured include a police officer whose cruiser was shot at in an exchange of gunfire. And it's very troubling to see this occur in so many locations across the country. A lot of innocent people, including some police officers, will lose their lives as a result. Now to today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis, and she did a great job of covering the Supreme Court decision that was released at midnight on Friday. And this relates to Trump's grandstanding, saying that churches are essential and ordering governors to reopen all of them without restrictions. One of the lawsuits was brought from California. It was against the governor's, that's Gavin Newsom, his recent policy statement, which allows counties to determine when churches reopen, but limiting the population to 25% of their normal capacity and a maximum of 100 people at any service. And the vote was 5-4, with the swing vote coming from the Chief Justice, John Roberts. He made 2 key points. The Constitution principally entrusts safety and health to politically accountable officials of the states, who should not be second-guessed by an unelected federal judiciary lacking the background competence and expertise to assess public health. Number 2, the state's decision does not violate constitutional protection of religion because churches have risks that activities treated more leniently do not. For example, banks and laundromats. Quoting from Roberts' decision, although California's guidelines place restrictions on places of worship, those restrictions appear consistent with the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. Similar or more severe restrictions apply to comparable secular gatherings, including lectures, concerts, movies, spectator sports, and theatrical performances, where large groups of people gather in close proximity for extended periods of time. And the order exempts or treats more leniently only dissimilar activities like grocery stores, banks, and laundromats in which people neither congregate nor remain in close proximity for extended periods. So this is a victory for freedom from religious extremism, from the entitlement that religious groups have tried to assert in the middle of the pandemic. And so I think this is an important decision, showing that John Roberts can occasionally find a center, and I'm speaking legally, not politically. It was Brett Kavanaugh, the new boy, who wrote the dissenting opinion. He said the basic constitutional problem is that comparable secular businesses are not subject to a 25% occupancy cap. Well, restaurants have been told to limit it to 50%. And no 2 tables, being served unless they're at least 6 feet apart. So So much for Brett. I like beer. So Linda provides some of the detail, including the CDC guidance that the court decision was partially based on. And, for example, she notes how the Trump White House amended the language to try to pander to religious, I won't call them extremists in this case, but those who took an extreme view of their rights. So the first CDC guideline read, take steps to limit the size of gatherings in accordance with the guidance and directives of state and local authorities. And then this line was added, and subject to protections of the First Amendment and any other applicable federal law. So that's the kind of monkey business that's been going on at the White House. Again, really dismissing the imperatives of public health officials in favor of indulging religious groups and putting them at risk. And speaking of the risk, as I watched TV over the weekend, I saw thousands of people in close proximity. Now, many of them were wearing masks. But that is, very limited protection from the lengthy times that people spent in very crowded circumstances. And it seems that people just said, screw it. And I hope that we don't have a wave of new infections that pop up over the next 2 or 3 weeks as the result of this risky behavior on the part of so many people who protested or even looted. So Linda gives us the daily count here. Worldwide, we are approaching 400,000 deaths. It's at 373,000. In the U.S., the number of deaths attributed to COVID-19 now stands at 104,700. The head of a hospital in Milan, in the northern region of Lombardy in Italy, said yesterday that the virus that struck that county has become less lethal. The swabs that were performed over the last 10 days showed a viral load in quantitative terms absolutely infinitesimal compared to the ones carried out a month or 2 months ago. Pending scientific evidence to support the thesis that the virus has disappeared, I would invite those who say they are sure not to confuse Italians, says the country's undersecretary at the health ministry. Russia will start giving its first drug approved to treat COVID-19 to patients next week, according to Reuters, a move that it hopes will ease strains on the health system and speed a return to normal economic life. Russian hospitals can begin giving the antiviral drug registered under the name Avifavir to patients starting on June 11th. And the White House is sending to Brazil 2 million doses of hydroxychloroquine. Oh, great. And 1,000 ventilators. Facebook has a virtual walkout underway today, and this is in reaction to Mark Zuckerberg's refusal to take down Trump's looting shooting tweet, which was also posted on Facebook on Friday. And this includes some of the top managers of the company, along with rank-and-file employees. They refused to work today in order to show their support for demonstrators across the country. And they spoke up. The hateful rhetoric advocating violence against black demonstrators by the U.S. president does not warrant defense under the guise of freedom of expression. Along with black employees in the company and all persons with a moral conscience, I'm calling for Mark to immediately take down the president's post advocating violence, murder, and imminent threat against black people. African Americans now make up just under 4% of the workforce at Facebook. And some employees call for the resignation of Joel Kaplan, the VP of Global Policy. He is seen as a strong conservative voice and an ally of Brett Kavanaugh, and thus is linked to Donald Trump. Roger McNamee, who was an early investor in Facebook who's turned a critic, he said their decision to leave Trump's posts alone was typical of a long-time pattern of behavior among big social media companies. Internet platforms that are pervasive, like Facebook and Google, must always align with power, including authoritarians. It's a matter of self-preservation. Facebook has been a key tool for authoritarians in Brazil, the Philippines, Cambodia, and Myanmar. In the U.S., Facebook has consistently ignored or altered its terms of service to the benefit of Trump. And here are a few more voices of employees at Facebook. Andrew Crow, head of design for the Portal video phone, went to Twitter. Giving a platform to incite violence and spread disinformation is unacceptable, regardless of who you are or if it's newsworthy. I disagree with Mark's position and will work to make change happen. Jason Sturman, a member of the company's R&D team and also one of the founders of Lucid, which was purchased by Facebook. I don't know what to do, but I know doing nothing is not acceptable. I'm a Facebook employee, completely disagrees with Mark's decision to do nothing about Trump's recent posts. There isn't a neutral position on racism. So speaking of tech and smartphones and that sort of thing, beware. Apple will be soon offering iOS 13.5 in an update, and there will be a beta version of Android 11. And these are operating systems for your smartphones, include the controversial tracking feature that uses Bluetooth. And as our correspondent in Maine, Dick Atlee, points out, Bluetooth is pretty lousy. Even the creators of Bluetooth said that it's not a very accurate measure of distance. And so if it says you were within 6 feet of somebody else who tests positive and then they use contact tracing to try to track you down, well, it's not really based on accurate data, and of course your privacy is once again being seriously compromised. And speaking of that, I'm surprised that the New York Times published a pretty lengthy article called How Your Phone Betrays Democracy. And they write that if you go to a protest, the signal is captured and collected, sometimes many times per minute, not by a drone, but by smartphone apps. The signal keeps broadcasting long after the protesters turn off their camera lights, head to their homes, and take off their masks. Any protester who brings a phone to a public demonstration is tracked, and that person's presence at the event is duly recorded in commercial data sets. At the same time, political parties are beginning to collect and purchase phone location for voter persuasion. Within minutes, with no special training and a little bit of Google searching, Times editors were able to single out and identify individuals at public demonstrations, large and small, from coast to coast. By tracking specific devices, we followed demonstrators from the 2017 Women's March back to their homes. We were able to identify individuals at the 2017 Inauguration Day Black Bloc protests. It was easy to follow them to their workplaces. In some instances, the February clash between anti-fascists and far-right supporters of Milo Yiannopoulos in Berkeley, California, it took little effort to identify the homes of protesters and their family members. And that's why I suggested earlier that maybe the serious Antifa agitators are smart enough to leave their phones at home. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it everywhere. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.